Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our briefing on our proposed legislation, an act enabling all students to thrive. My name is Lisa Lazar, and I am the Executive Director of the Massachusetts chapter of Educators for Excellence. We are a teacher-led organization that helps to ensure that teachers have a leading voice in policies that impact their students and their profession. First, I would love to thank Senator Piano and Representative Sousa for co-sponsoring our bill and being here today. Senator Piano and Representative Sousa, would you please share a bit about what brings you here to our conversation?
Rep. Sousa, if you'd like to go ahead.
Thank you so much. My name is Priscilla Sousa. I represent the wonderful city of Framingham, and I am a proud Brazilian immigrant. My background from a different life prior to becoming a state representative, I say previous life that ended January 1st of this year, was to be on the Framingham School Committee. So I'm deeply committed to education. The district in Framingham where I served has over 60% of the student population identifying as some sort of a cultural linguistic minority. I myself was one of those students back in the day and am product of the Framingham Public Schools and think I did okay for myself.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today. Really, honored to be here to speak to you all about this bill. I come from, similar to Rep. Sousa, I was also a former school committee member. My parents are teachers. My mom actually retired just a couple of weeks ago from Lawrence Public Schools, 30 years. My dad did, I believe, 25. And I was a teacher myself. I deeply, deeply care about education. And one of the things that, as someone that has not just been sort of, grounded in education because of my parents, but also as somebody has gone through a public school system, I understand the importance of having diverse teachers, diverse educators around you, having the proper mentors and the proper individuals to understand what you're going through. Cultural competency is extremely important. And I think that that's one of the big messages about this bill that resonates with me personally and that you will all come to learn a little bit more about. Thank you, Lisa.
No, thank you so much, Senator Piano, Representative Sousa, for being here today and sharing those remarks. I'd also want to thank Representative Jeff Turco for joining us here today as well. And so we are here today to underscore the importance of teacher diversity in our communities and our need to take urgent action to protect the advances made in diversifying our teacher workforce. You will hear from a panel of legislators, teachers, and parent advocates on why they are supporting this legislation and why we need your support. So today's session will begin with a short presentation highlighting key data throughout the state that showcases the need for the implementation of this bill. Then we will hear from our esteemed panel and take questions from the audiences and media. I would love to take a moment to introduce the rest of our panelists before we get started. As we were introduced before, first we have Senator Pavel Piano, who's representing the 1st Essex District and a co-sponsor of the bill. We have Representative Priscilla Sousa from the 6th Middlesex District, another co-sponsor of our bill. We have Cynthia Mendes, who is a new teacher developer in BPS and a former Brockton School Committee member joining us here today. And we also have Ivelisse Caraballo, Executive Director of CPLAN, which is a parent advocacy organization working here in Massachusetts. We can share the screen. So the impact of teachers of color on student achievement is well documented and well understood, and particularly in this room. Students who are taught by diverse teachers are less likely to be suspended, more likely to complete high school and go to college, as well as more likely to be referred to gifted programs. And so the good news is that states are rapidly diversifying their workforces. Teachers of color are 1.5 times more likely to be new to the profession relative to their representation in the workforce overall. Educators for Excellence and TNTP work together to determine what does this look like state by state in a recent national research project. In Massachusetts, what we found is that our educators of color are 2.1 times more likely, which means we've been doing an incredible job of recruiting diverse talent into the workforce. And so currently across Massachusetts, we have worked tirelessly to increase the diversity of the teaching workforce, where currently educator diversity is the highest it's been in the state, currently at 10% across Massachusetts, which equals to a little under 8,000 teachers represented. And so while this progress is great news, it's at risk of being rolled back in states that use a seniority-based approach to layoffs. In Massachusetts is one of only 12 states in the country that still requires this. So in Massachusetts, teachers without professional teaching status or teachers who have been teaching for less than 3 years in the same district are laid off first. Districts can decide in what order to lay them off. Once all teachers without professional teaching status are laid off, the law requires that teachers with professional teacher status be laid off in order of quality. However, it'll be unlikely that districts would ever lay off teachers who've had PTS, given how many teachers don't have it. So in practice, the state's approach is essentially last in, first out. And so taken all together, all of this means that Massachusetts is the state in which teachers of color are most at risk of being laid off because it's the state where the most progress has been made and one of the 12 states that are requiring seniority-based layoffs. A combination of rapid student enrollment decline and the expiration of ESSER funds. And ESSER funding is funding that districts were given as we were coming out of the pandemic, and that funding ends in September 2024, make layoffs likely in states across the country in the 2024-2025 school year, bringing all of this to a head. And let's take a closer look of how this would play out in Massachusetts. In our state, student enrollment has decreased by 4% in the past decade, while the employment of full-time teachers has increased by 8%. That means that currently, despite acute teacher shortages in some places, there are more teachers in school buildings per student today than there've been in the past decade. And so in terms of a fiscal cliff, Massachusetts is in a better position than most states because the expiration of ESSER funding coincides with a planned increase in state funding that will offset much of the cliff. However, despite this, the state still faces significant financial uncertainty, with districts across the state grappling with their budgets and forced to make incredibly tough decisions. So we've laid out the problem in Massachusetts and it's urgent. Now let's talk about the solutions we're proposing, what our bill exempts. And you will probably notice that after all of this talk about teacher diversity, the bill doesn't actually specifically exempt teachers of color. This is intentional. Given the recent US Supreme Court decision on race-based admissions in higher education, we worked to ensure our bill does not run afoul of the ruling or how the ruling's analysis may be broadened to the future of K-12 public education. So instead of specifically exempting teachers of color, it leverages proxies that we know align with quality or diversity or both as exemptions. For example, we include the exemption for teachers who have graduated from a high school in a district in which they teach, but only if that district has a higher percentage of high-need students than does the state. This means that a teacher who graduated from a Boston Public public schools high school and now teaches in the district would be exempt. But a teacher who graduated from Needham Public High School and now teaches in the district would not. In this way, we know the exemption is more likely to protect teachers of color who are more likely to have graduated from high needs districts than our white teachers. And so we've had, and at this point, we've now gotten a grounding on the problem and the proposed solution. And I'm excited today to hear from our panelists further about how this issue is impacting our communities, our families, and our students. Right, next slide. As a reminder, here's our esteemed panelists. And we can take that off while I read our first question. And so again, in Massachusetts, teachers are 107% more likely to be in their first 3 years of teaching than their white colleagues. So this means that under the current policy of seniority-based layoffs, also known as last in, first out, LIFO, future teacher layoffs will disproportionately impact teachers of color and hurt their ability to have a lasting impact on students and their communities. So to kick things off, I would love to ask, why is this bill so important to all of you individually and your own personal story? What speaks to you? What personally speaks to you? Senator Piano, I'd love to start with you.
Sure. So I thank you, Lisa. I mentioned a little bit earlier about my interest and why I support this bill, but I think I'll tell just a little story. So when I was teaching, I was working with students that were part of the DYS system. There was a particular student who, teachers have come and went, and basically what they had told me was that this child was not going to learn math, that they tried everything, he's not going to learn it, basically like just skip him over. And I remember my first week and a half was about connecting with him. We talked about, the neighborhood he grew up in, which, like I knew, because we both came from Lawrence. We talked in Spanish. We talked about reggaeton artists. We basically, I connected with him culturally. I connected with him whatever ways that I could. And then afterwards, we started actually talking about math. He went from saying that he was a horrible math student, so he didn't want to touch math, to 4 months later telling me that he was an amazing math student, which to me was a huge win. But that sort of showed me sort of the importance of just having someone that has gone through the same things that the students in my class had gone through. And I think that that's key. And what we're finding is that when at least the folks that I know now that are in the education system that are just coming in, that they're in their early 20s, they jump into to be a teacher, is that if they end up leaving and they're pushed out, they don't apply to, at least anecdotally from my own experience, they're not applying to another school. They're just saying, well, I gave it my all. For whatever reason, it wasn't working out. I'm just going to go and make money. Because right now, teachers do, especially teachers that are working in some of our gateway cities, are not making as much as some of their counterparts that are living in the suburbs and are dealing with less issues. So that's one of the reasons why I'm supportive of the bill. I want to make sure that we are doing everything we can to protect these new diverse talent that we have, and to make sure that they have a fair shot and that we don't go backwards with the gains that we've had so far.
Thank you. Representative Sousa, I would love to hear your remarks.
Thank you so much. In addition to my linguistic cultural background, the majority of my time spent on the school committee has been one of the number one issues that we hear was diversity in our teaching staff, in our staff. Basically, people and adults in the building that look like the children, because that leads to increased parent engagement, fewer disciplinary issues, improved academic performance, developmental performance. So all of that is incredibly important. And to build up on what Senator Payano just said, you take a young professional who has decided to dedicate their life to teaching, they get laid off. Yeah, they're going to go into another district because why would they go to a different district or a different school, apply to work, where they're going to be the first ones kicked out the door the minute things get tight again? It makes absolutely no sense. And it's keeping um, teachers who represent the student population outside of the classroom. All of the work that not only the school committee that I was in, but the school committees across the Commonwealth are doing to build a pipeline for a more diverse workforce is useless if we cannot keep these teachers in the classroom, if they're the first ones to be kicked out of the door. And one example of the importance of this, one of our elementary schools, Harmony Grove Elementary, majority of it is immigrant student occupied or populated. And over the past couple of years, the efforts to make to diversify, to have a more culturally competent teaching force has turned the school from a PTO that is mostly non-English speaking, from the least active to the most active. And we have 9 elementary schools here in Framingham. And that has turned into improved academic performance. That has transitioned into better disciplinary stats. The data's there. So thank you.
No, thank you so much, Representative Sousa. I would also like to take a quick moment to just thank Representative Aaron Saunders, Representative David Meridian, Representative Sam Montano, and Representative Steve Owens for joining us here today. And Cynthia Mendes, would love to hear from you again. So like, to repeat the question, why is this bill important to you? And what's your own personal story that connects back to this piece?
So, fun fact, Senator Payano's mother, Maria Payano, was actually my native speaker Spanish teacher in Lawrence High School freshman year. And the reason I mention that is because as native speakers, we don't necessarily know how to read and write the language effectively because we learn how to speak it through listening. And she motivated me to go abroad in college. And I'm a fluent speaker of Spanish and English that I could literally say I read and write it. So that's just a quick story of how important it is to have educators of color that understand what it is to be in our shoes and what it is to push us to do better, right? This bill is really important to me, not just because of amazing educators like Miss Bayano, but also other educators that have been mentors that honestly I am where I am today is because of them. And a lot of them are women of color that I can identify closely with. But as an educator of color myself, I know how it is to go through budget cuts. I know how it is to worry about if I'm going to have a job for the next academic year. I know what it is to live through the struggle of going into a classroom with students on special education, where administration themselves have very little knowledge. And I have to kind of just figure it out, right? And then I figure out the job. I build relationships with these students and families. I accomplish great gains for my students and I, while still trying to develop my career, right? Still trying to get licensure. Let's talk about MTELs, which are super hard to pass because they're not made like people like myself in mind. And then worrying if I'm going to be back the next year is an added stress that is not necessary and should literally be non-existent, especially in places that we decide to teach in. I have taught in Lawrence, Mass, where my family lives. I have taught in Chelsea, Mass. I currently teach in Boston, Mass. And I was, like you mentioned, a former school committee of Brockton. All these have something very much in common, which is these are urban districts, right? These are districts where we have a lot of transformational schools that with very little resources, because unfortunately, due to budgeting or decisions of when we think about budgeting, and they're not honestly the easiest places to work because of the structures put in place. So then having to worry that if I'm going to be hired again, it's just something that one, it's not ideal, and two, like State Rep Sosa mentioned, right? It's insanity to be having these pipelines where I have seen in Brockton, we invest so much money on our educators of color to then just let them go. That's insane to me. Nobody invests millions of dollars on something and just lets it go. And that's exactly what's happening. And that's why I support this bill, because I think if we're going to invest, especially to have these connections with our students and be able to diversify our workforce, then I believe that we should have sustainability and make sure that it's continuous.
Thank you, Cynthia. Evelise, last but not least, I'm excited to hear your thoughts as a parent. Like, how does this impact you and your community?
Thank you so much, Lisa. So I want to say that, first things first, numbers don't lie. The data, I feel like it's important to reiterate that the data says that students have better academic performance when they connect with their teachers. But I think it's also very important to mention and highlight that it's also a fact that it benefits all students regardless of their own race when they have a Black teacher. And now I want to just go into the the fact that psychologically we all desire a sense of belonging. That's a requirement that we all just naturally have. And it is so difficult for a student to have a sense of belonging when they're not represented not only by the teachers, they're not represented in the curriculum in any way, shape, or form that helps them project a future for themselves with their individuality, with their uniqueness, right? It's almost as if they have to become someone else to be successful. At least that's the message that we're sending them. The other thing is that they're also not represented in the school culture and climate. And so what we're doing is that we're creating a huge disconnect for the students to be able to thrive on so many levels and capacities. I will also add the fact that to move away from the racial component of it, there are other components to diversity. The linguistic diversity is truly important because where parents are designed to be partners when it comes to educating our children, how is it that we're supposed to support our children if we can't connect with those very people that they're being educated by at school, right? We need to be able to understand and have a connection and build relationships with those that we're partnering with to support our children's educational success. And so there are so many reasons. I can go down the list of reasons why I really support this bill. I want to say that a way that it connects with my story personally is that I am a parent who navigated the education system for two children. And my daughter often came home feeling she went to predominantly, well, no, let me just call it what it is. She went to a school district that was all white. She was probably often the only Afro-Latina in her class. And the way that she was treated often made her come home feeling not worthy, not smart enough, not enough at all. And so I had to like teach her a lot of those things and then reteach her about her uniqueness and her greatness and everything that she had to offer. There was so much that this diversity could offer and lend itself to. And so it just made my job 10 times harder because I had to kind of like unteach her some things to then reteach her. And that took a lot of energy. That's not even getting into helping her with her actual assignments, right? And so that's one way that it affected me directly was the experience of my daughter. Um, so yeah, I'll stop right there and I'll wait for the other questions to share a little bit more. Thank you so much.
No, appreciate that, Evelise. And a warm welcome to Representative Kessler and Representative Kearns for joining us here today. And so if we don't take action now, what does this impending fiscal cliff mean for our novice teachers? And how will students be affected? And I'll start with you again, Representative Sousa.
I'm going to share a story from my district. In one of the schools where we have large diverse linguistic Spanish-speaking population, a speech therapist was brought on a couple of years ago. And this was very incredibly important in our district, in that particular school, because unfortunately, every assessment that was done as far as speech therapists was concerned, was a little bit off. The information that the parents had at home, because they know their own children, and what was coming out on paper was just not off because the speech therapist was not Spanish speaking. Unfortunately, fortunately, once a speech therapist who spoke Spanish was hired by the district in that particular school was found, it was like night and day. All of a sudden, these children are developing, and we're seeing the data in their performance that our district relies on iReady. So we were able to track almost immediately the change and the development of our students. If something were to happen in this, and our last one and first one out, educators were going to have to leave. All of a sudden, we were going to have to, it would be a major setback for these families, for these students. Remembering, and I know this is, every school committee member says this, and it's a little bit flowery, but you don't get a second shot at a third grade. Once that developmental milestone is lost, it's lost.
No, thank you, Representative Sousa. Representative Senator Piano.
Sure. I mean, I think Rep Sousa said it best. So I think I'll talk a little bit about sort of like the mindset of that student. You know, a couple of years ago, I happened to be driving to Starbucks, and I saw that kids were they were having like a little rally at like 11:30 a.m. and I'm like, I'm a very inquisitive person, so I stopped by to find out what was going on. And the conversation was about some teachers that were let go. And the students deeply cared about the teachers that they were mentioning were all teachers that had a Spanish last name. And what they talked about was how deeply these teachers cared about them, how they connected with those teachers, how these teachers, they did not understand, like it was just like this confusion, this feeling of being not cared about by the school district, because they found that one teacher that did care about them, and they were no longer going to be with them the following year. And I think that that's something that definitely, it's one of the things that drives me to this bill. I mean, it's one thing looking at the data. Data says that if you have a teacher of color, that the students of color are more likely to do well. But one thing is seeing it in numbers. Another thing is actually having conversations with students and seeing it in action, seeing how that plays with their emotion, and how that those teachers are able to drive them to do better in school. And as we mentioned before, when you are trying to motivate individuals to get into the education workforce, you want to be able to show that it's a career that's sustainable, is a career where you're not going to be sucker punched without knowing it's coming, right? And that's one of the things that a lot of young folks are looking at. If they're gonna go into this profession and they're doing an incredible, amazing job, are they at risk of losing that career and starting all over again and going through the same risks somewhere else? Which I think it's one of the things that a lot of folks I think are talking about right now.
Thank you, Senator. Evelise, same question. So what does this impending fiscal cliff mean for our newer teachers, and how will students be affected?
So I think that it's disheartening to know the impact that it's going to have on students when they've connected to a teacher that that looks like them or just understands their culture and is able to use some of those cultural norms as part of their teaching. And then from one minute to the next have to go back to, not feeling, again, that sense of belonging that they had. I'll give one example. A person that I know, whose name I will keep anonymous, started working and started connecting with the students immediately and started using sports to teach math. So the students have been learning, the Y and the X axis, and they just wasn't getting it. They're like, we don't get this math. And so this person used sports. It's a male, and so he used sports to be able to teach, this kind of math, and the kids got it immediately. And I will say that he also knew anime, and that's kind of like what the kids were into. So he'd use all of those things that they kind of had in common in ways that they could connect to really get them interested in learning. That person was one of the first people to go from the district when the budget deficit happened. And so those students, a lot of them have expressed how they're no longer going to have that sense of like that connection, right? And they're not as interested in learning as they were before because they were able to experience a fun learning style, a fun teaching style. And now they're going back to what they would consider boring. And so I think it affects both because both the adult was heartbroken, but so were the students. And so I'm wondering whether or not those students are still thriving today because they were able to see that learning can actually be fun. Another point that I want to make is that I live in Brockton, and right now in the high school, there are so many students sitting in a cafeteria all day, losing instructional learning because of the teacher shortage, right? And a lot of the teachers that are still employed by the district are calling out in like ridiculous amounts, right? Within the first month, there was such a high amount of teachers who called out. And when some of them are asked why, a lot of them don't even feel safe. And I think that has a lot to do with the cultural disconnect, right? Um, them just not having that connection with the students and having that comfort is what makes them feel threatened regularly. And that's another component of it that's real, is that, sometimes when you don't understand the cultural nuances, you are going to feel threatened by everything because it's the unknown, right? We fear the unknown. And so it's something that I've been able to visibly see. Like it's not a prediction. I've been able to physically and visibly see the impact that it's having. And that's not even including the students who are on IEPs that require one-to-one services. They're losing, this is like a legal issue at this point. Those students are not only losing instructional learning, but they're also losing those services that they were promised as part of a legal document. So just wanted to share that point that I've been able to see. It's not a prediction. I wanted to share that. Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Evelise. And you highlighted something really important and context for the audience today about what happened in Brockton. And so Brockton experienced their fiscal cliff early. And that meant that in June of like 2023, Brockton had about, I believe, a $14 million shortfall in their budget, which equaled about 130 of their teachers being let go. And this equaled about 30% of the diversity and their BIPOC teachers being let go in that time. And what we ended up seeing was a lot of the recruitment and investments made into the community being erased. And so Cynthia, would love for you to continue really building upon what we heard from Representative Sousa, Senator Piano, and from Evelise here about like, what does this mean for our teachers and our students, and how are they being affected by this?
I think for our students especially, one thing that I as an educator saw, National Honor Society is like one of the biggest, like it's a national, right? And it's an honor to be in that society, but you need a teacher recommendation. Now, there's a lot of bias when it comes to certain teachers' recommendation. And this is why it's important to have data shows, right? The achievement gap shows that students that are not being taught by teachers that can see them, that can meet them where they are, they're not even being taught grade level, right? They're not being given certain rigor. When students are taught by teachers that look and have similar experiences to them, the rigor is crazy. They try to exceed the rigor and also meet students, not just at grade level, but beyond. They give them this rigor. So when you think of National Honor Society, it being a recommendation by teachers, I personally saw the data in one of my schools in Boston Public Schools, which was South Boston High School. All students were either white or Asian in a school that 90% of the students were either Black or brown students. Black or Latinx, Hispanic. So for me, that was just a shock. It was like our National Honor Society is made up of students that are not the majority in the school. So when we looked at that bias, we had to take a step back and think, how is teacher recommendation happening? Who are the people on the board that are looking at these applications? How are we promoting these opportunities and giving them? And we were able to rethink those processes and structures to be able to allow other students this amazing opportunity to be in National Honor Society. So saying that is, if we don't take action now, if we don't take action for our newest teachers that are teachers that, let's just say, teaching is not, I'm a new teacher developer. Teaching is not something that people are signing up and there's waitlisting for teaching. Teaching is a job that unfortunately has changed drastically in the past 5 years. People no longer want to teach. It's not what it was before. There's a whole checklist, and the demands, honestly, I think are just not, they're not realistic, the demands. So not only will we lose amazing teachers that have committed and want to serve our students, but we're going to lose our citizens. What's going to happen to our society if we think of it long term in regards to preparing our students for not just like teaching careers, but also to be citizens of our society. So I just think about not just necessarily the short-term impact, but let's talk about the long-term impact, especially with mental health being the number one, and not understanding, if we don't understand certain experiences, certain struggles, certain traumas that are just hard to meet a student if, one, you don't speak their language, like many of us have mentioned in this panel, but two, if you don't have that family, because that family communication, maybe because of fear, or you just don't know how to reach that family. But honestly, this is not just an impact that's going to impact in the educational sector. It's going to be like literally like society completely. So I think we need to take action in regards to rethinking the career, but making sure that the career is sustainable, not just for our teachers of color, for all around, especially as well.
No, thank you so much, Cynthia. Evelis, did you want to add a piece to that?
Yes, thank you so much, Cynthia, for bringing up the bias in like the recommendations, because I want to add another point to that, is that studies have also shown that students of color are less likely to be let into college prep, honors, and advanced courses. And as we all know, universities look to how many of those classes you took in order for them to accept you. And so that bias is hindering a lot of students from getting into their top universities, if at all, right? If they get accepted at all. And so I just wanted to add that point in terms of bias as it pertains to recommendations. Thank you.
No. Oh, thank you for that. And so we have the honor of having school committee members and former school committee members on this panel. And so can you speak to why this bill would be of interest to school committee members? Like, how would you handle this issue? How did you handle this when you were on the school committee? I would love to start with Senator Piano.
I think Cynthia would probably be will better answer it. What I'll say is, while I was on the school committee, this was maybe 8 years ago, my goal was trying to get diverse teachers into the school system, trying to build up a pipeline. So those that that issue wasn't necessarily like present at the moment. Now we have a way more diverse amount of teachers than we did back then. So I think that this is why it's an issue now, that the teacher workforce, not that it's where I want it to be, but it's better than what it was a few years ago. And it just so happens that a lot of those teachers are teachers that are newer.
Cynthia.
Yes. So I was in the Brockton School Committee for 4 years. I got voted out just this past year because I moved for a different location in Brockton, so I had to rerun for a different seat. I do want to clarify there was 37% of teachers of color who were pink slipped. In the formula that they use to be pink slip these teachers after intentionally recruiting 3 years of teachers of color, right? So what I've noticed, recruitment is not necessarily the problem, is retention. State Senator, State Rep Sosa said it best. Pipelines are useless if we cannot keep the teachers in the door. Again, with teachers being pushed out, and I know Brockton gets a diversification grant, where it makes sure that they support their teachers with licensure, that they give them professional development, that they help them sometimes further their education or just get their bachelor degrees. So all this investment, like I mentioned earlier, for me, it's insane that we put so much money and all of a sudden we're like, you gotta go because we just can't sustain you. For me, it just doesn't make sense. It's like insane to be like, we're gonna invest in you and then we're gonna give the investment that we gave to you to other districts or to a different career. So in regards to the formula and how it was, so it's similar to what Lisa talked about, which is the last in, first out. So if you don't have professional status, you haven't been in the district for 3 years, you are the first one to let go. In Brockton, I have to also say that it wasn't just teachers of colors that were let go. It was homegrown teachers that literally sat in these seats that these students are in. They were the first ones let go. And then when you think about what's happening now, the formula, one, it's very antiquated. And two, they let go of so many amazing teachers that had to make sure that they had a job for next year, that now we don't have enough teachers. So for me, it's just like, how are we working? We're working backwards. So if this bill is interest to school committee members, absolutely it is. Why? Because it will help them it will help them see the fruition of grants that they're voting in place, budgets that they're putting towards, for example, DEI office, professional development, you know, to grow their own. A lot of times they encourage paraprofessionals to, they put money towards being able to develop, like to further their career and become teachers. So it will see the flotation long term. So if they understand, like, how do we not just protect our teachers of color from the investment that we have put on, but also understanding the importance of it. What I've noticed as school committee is, in school committee, you have people in seats that are really, in my opinion, in my perspective, are out of touch with education because their career is not necessarily education. So if they're not reading onto these things, they don't have much information. So having a bill will give them more clarity on the importance of how we lay off, and think about that. What's the formula that we're using when we're talking about budget cuts? And this is going to be a huge conversation this budgeting season, which has happened currently, because ESSER funds is non-existing next year. So Brockton, we just had a deficit of 14.4 million. I mean, God forbid, we in other districts have that. But unfortunately, with the ESSER funds that provided for people that are in positions that are no longer teaching, what's going to happen to those people? Are they just going to be let go? Are they going to be able to come back into the class? This is a conversation that we're not really having, that we should be having, right? So it's like we put money in it, but then what happens when that money is no longer there? And that's why I think bills like this, bills for the Diversification Act as well, where they're promoting teachers of color to be able to think about licensure, are important for sustainability.
No, thank you. Representative Sousa, would you like to add anything before we continue?
Thank you. Thank you, Cynthia, that was a conference listener. I think that was a very abridged list of why this is important to school committee members. But it really, I think the only one I'd like to highlight is fiscal responsibility. Recruiting teachers to fit a specific need costs money. In my own district, in Framingham, over the past year, it was mentioned before, recruiting, there's no line out the door to enter the teaching profession right now. That line gets even shorter when you're talking about teachers that have cultural competency and the linguistic proficiency. And we use those terms very specifically because it's not about just racial diversity. In fourth grade, I had a teacher, Michelle DaCosta. She was American. I actually talked to her this week. She became a principal in Framingham a couple years later, but she had a tremendous impact in my education. I developed a love of reading in her classroom. She and I had there were no common racial background. However, she spoke my language. She spoke Portuguese. And she was able to understand culturally where I was coming from. So it goes far beyond just racial diversity. It's cultural competency and linguistic proficiency. But why this is important to school committee members is that it costs money to recruit teachers that fit this profile, especially for those of us that have a specific, very diverse district. So it's money that's being spent in these recruiting efforts when we cannot retain these teachers in the classroom. It becomes a wasted effort. And I know it's what we keep saying, but it's incredibly frustrating, especially when a lot of our school committees across the Commonwealth are elected officials, and we have to be accountable to our voters as how fiscally responsible we're being in these budgets.
No, thank you so much, Representative. As we're closing, as we're ending near the end of time, wanting to move to audience questions, we probably have time for 1 or 2 questions before we have to close out. Do we have any questions in this room?
Lisa, oh, sorry. I think you have a question.
If I could, I'll ask you a question. And thank you. This has been informative. I appreciate the invitation. Brockton, I think, is a unique situation because of its sort of, I don't think there's any other school district in the Commonwealth that's had the fiscal crisis that they did. But in light of the fact that the legislature has fully funded the Student Opportunity Act the last couple of years, and I don't think there's a mood not to do that going forward. Isn't the solution to this problem just to make sure we give school districts the adequate funding, and maybe we put triggers in on how they spend their money so that they don't do layoffs? I mean, is that a less, because I think you've raised a very valid point about, kids. I represent the city of Revere, 45% of Revere, very diverse community. In Winthrop, not so much, but probably more surprising than most people would expect. And it's so who the teachers are is very important to the Revere School District in particular. But it seems to me with all the money that we're putting towards school districts that we ought to be able to say to them, instead of continuing to hire $250,000, $300,000 a year superintendents, maybe they ought to make sure that in assistant superintendents and deputy assistant superintendents, that maybe they ought to focus the money towards the teachers that are actually producing. Just a thought. And thank you again.
If I may, Lisa, you probably have a different answer than mine. What I will say, Rep, thank you so much for that question. It's an interesting idea. Now, what I would say is that within our current system, districts like the control that they have over their overall budget. I think it'd be difficult placing controls on them. There might be, there'll probably be some pushback, in having those discussions, but I understand what you're saying. I think that, every time, this is something that from the moment I started public service, one of the things I would look at is like, all right, so the state is giving X amount, are we actually using that amount to the spirit of why it was given? And I think it's one of the things that we need to ensure that our school committee members are having not just fiscal control over the budget, but are planning as to how this will look like in 5 or 10 years. But there are times when certain things occur that might not be on people's agenda. And if that were to happen, then we would run up to this case where we would be losing these young, diverse talent.
Now, thank you, Senator. You shared a good chunk of what I would have shared in that instance as well. And the other piece that we want to name is that the districts that receive the most ESSER funding are the districts that serves our at-risk students. At-risk students in Massachusetts are students with disabilities, low-income students, and English language learners. And so that also means that as we're thinking about like the money that's coming into the districts, while we're really excited about the Student Opportunity Act and the Millionaire's Tax and the money that's coming into the school districts, we are realistic in understanding that gaps will still exist, especially in our districts that are serving our most at-risk students. And so wanting to have other pieces in place when we're thinking about what is that ecosystem we're looking to solve for. And again, we came back in the grounding that at this moment in time, educator diversity is at the highest it's been in Massachusetts at 10%. And we've worked incredibly hard to get it at that point. And it's incredibly devastating if we would see rollbacks because of these budget cliffs that are coming in the next few years. Is there any other questions? I know I have teacher wait time, so I know that was a little uncomfortable, but if there are no other questions, I can absolutely move forward. And if there's more questions here, happy to answer them and follow up. Give it 2 seconds, a lot less than the first time. And so I want to thank everyone for coming today and joining our panel discussion on an act enabling all students to thrive. Like, we had an incredible panel, really give voice and life to the data that we've been sharing around what's happening in our state. I really hope you've enjoyed hearing from our panel and the additional context to like why this is so critical. I especially want to elevate Senator Piano sharing his story about the students he met that was gathering, talking about the loss of their educators that they were really connected to. Really hearing Evilise speak to, again, the devastation of how the students are really impacted when they're losing these teachers that they're working and connecting with and building with. And even Evilise naming that she's wondering, are these students thriving now with the loss of their teachers? And I really want to highlight Cynthia, who is naming that recruitment is not the issue. It is retention. We are able to recruit. And Representative Sousa, like, we need to be retaining the teachers we're investing in. Like, that is at the core of what we're talking about. And so, like, the numbers are speaking for themselves. This issue is not going away. And so most importantly, this legislation like helps diverse educators throughout the state remain in their classrooms, which, as we've heard today, is vital to student success. And I would be more than happy to answer any additional questions and to meet with anyone further to discuss this bill. And so we hope that you would consider the impact of this legislation and are calling on the members of the legislature to show their support by co-sponsoring this bill. If your office is interested in learning more, please reach out to us via the contact information and materials provided. And I want to thank everyone again on this blustering, snowy day joining us for this virtual conversation. I want you to have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you again for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
I'll leave.
Mm-hmm.
Oh gosh. Like, moment.
There's definitely